Income Tax 2020. Why and how to learn tax law. Come in and relax for Income Tax 2020. The first question when learning just about anything is, why should I learn it? What is going to be the benefit to me to learn this skill? Therefore, what will be the benefit of learning income tax? The benefit will differ from individual to individual, but we'll go over some of the common benefits here. We'll go over some of the more obvious benefits first, and then we'll take a look at some of the less obvious benefits after. Some of the more obvious benefits would be to save money. Obviously, we want to be filing our tax return and filing it in such a way that we're going to be paying as little tax as legally possible and therefore save money on it. If we are a tax preparer, then we want to be preparing taxes for clients in such a way that we're going to be helping them to save money, paying as little tax as legally possible to do so. And of course, we want to be in compliance with the law. So we want to make sure that although we're trying to pay as little as possible in the tax, we want to make sure we're paying as little as legally possible and make sure that we are in compliance paying the tax that is required to pay and complying with the filing requirements as well. And then we might have a desire to start a business with the income tax as well. So we might be thinking of being a tax preparer, in which case we would of course want to learn the tax law and think about where our niche could be within tax preparation so that we might be able to start a business around that niche. So these are some of the more obvious reasons to learn tax law. A less obvious reason to learn tax law is that it's interesting. It's interesting to learn tax law. This isn't the first thing that would come to most people's minds if you were to ask them why they would learn tax law, but I think it's true, and to show that, to demonstrate that, let's just think of some things that people do typically find interesting. If you look at some of the common topics that would be on like news channels and whatnot, they are there because of course people kind of find them interesting. They're competing of course for ratings. And some of the things that would be included is, how should we judge our government? What is the purpose of government? What should government do? These are questions that we're always asking. They're always being reflected on news channels. Now, in the news channels, of course, they're usually in the context of a particular story that may be revolving around a particular person or a particular politician. But the broader question is basically always, is the government doing what we the people want? What do we the people want the government to be doing? And is the government then reflecting the desires in that way? We can ask the question, what is justice? And again, news channels are always kind of putting this question out there, usually in the guise of something that possibly we might determine to be unjust, right? Because that's going to be an interesting story. This thing's going contra, this particular situation is contra to what we believe should be just, and that could be an interesting kind of news story that would be drawing attention, drawing ratings. Another one is, what is fair, right? What would be fair? And again, news stories will typically say, well, this particular thing, this thing that's happening right here is not fair. No, most of the time, the news stories that are going out there, the things that are popular, are bringing in a human element to it, bringing it down to a one individual case, or talking about it in terms of a particular situation, because again, that particular individual story is more interesting than a broader context story about what is fair, in general, what should government be doing in general. But really, these are kind of some of the questions that are underlying those types of questions. Some of the problems we have are that we don't often take a step back and look at the broader questions that are being implied by the particular circumstance and situation that is going on. Also, oftentimes we don't do a good job of defining our terms, such as just and fair. These terms are terms that are used many times in ways that not only don't add substantive content to the statement, but they actually take away substantive content from the statement. For example, you'll often hear phrases such as, I'm against something like an unfair tax law. And that's completely meaningless, or it doesn't really add anything to the conversation, because everybody is against unfair tax law. The word unfair is doing all the work in that sentence. The question is, of course, what do you mean by unfair? Define what unfair is, because obviously the tax law is going to have different goals and objectives. We need to then decide what is fair and then construct the tax code around that, or whatever law that we're talking about. The same can be said for just, right? What does it mean to be just in this particular situation? Different situations can have different meanings, or people might determine different things to be just in a particular situation. You first need to determine what is just, and then explain why this particular situation is not just, and then how you can change it in those situations. So the result is that we find these stories interesting mainly because they're presented with a human element within them, or have a current topic that is of interest to us. but we often can't get a lot of information or make a real good judgment about the information because we're zoomed in too close. We're not looking at the broader questions here, and because of this ambiguous language that's being put in place. So the difference between the ambiguous language and kind of the stories that are out there and action would be the difference between the stories and basically the law, in this case going to be the tax code. The tax code can actually be more interesting then because you have the actual information in the laws. You see the action that has actually happened. So when you hear arguments about something being just or fair and there's no definition of them, you can actually take a look at the tax code and say, well, this is what's being reflected in the tax code. Here's going to be the results. This is what basically the law says. And then you can go from that point forward. You can get a lot more in depth in terms of the actual substance of the arguments that are often being presented in kind of a superficial type of way, and get into them in much more of a deeper way. How to learn tax law. Now, when you first start learning tax law, you're probably learning it for your own business or your own tax return. You're trying to get the information you need to prepare the tax return. Or if you're going into business and you're picking up the tax law in order to do what needs to be done in order to run your business, then you're trying to just pick up the code. You're trying to just say, hey, I want this for a useful purpose, which is so that I can prepare the tax return and so on going forward. But the more you get into the tax law, it's going to be difficult to just memorize it without having any context related to it. It's easier to memorize things when there's going to be a story related to it. So in other words, if you just open up the tax code and just try to memorize what the tax code is, it's actually a little bit more difficult than if you try to say, well, why is the tax code that way? Why did they do this way or that way? And that, of course, makes it a little bit more interesting as well. So if you just try to learn the rules, you can do so, or try to look up the rules, you can do so, but it's going to be less interesting, less fun. It's going to be harder to kind of memorize that. If you were to say, look at it, and as the laws change, you can look at it and say, well, why did they change the law like that? What are they trying to do with that? Then it makes it more interesting. You'll probably be able to memorize it better. And if you have conversations, say, with clients that are asking you about the tax law, if you're a tax preparer, they often want more context. They want a story, right? They want a story. They want to know why is it the tax law is doing this or that? And it's a lot more interesting to them if you can give them your opinion as to what the government is doing in this situation or that situation. And the tax law is a fairly reliable representation of what happens over time as well. In other words, if you were to take a look at the changes that have happened in the tax law over time, it can tell you a lot about what's going on during those times and what's being thought of during those times as well. So it's interesting to see how the tax law changes. And just remember, of course, that the tax law is something that's going to be changing all the time. So you're going to want to be into it. If you're going to be working in tax law, then you're going to want to be into the changes that are going to be happening in the future. And it's more interesting to be into what's going to be happening in the future if you think about it in the context of why those changes are happening. What's being, what are the arguments in terms of this change happening this way or that way? And it's more likely then that you'll be engaged with the tax law. You'll be more current with the tax law as it changes. It'll be somewhat more exciting to look at the tax law because it's a reflection of what's currently going on in the economy and in the society and in government and so on. And that's being reflected, of course, in the tax law. So if you can, put some opinion on it and actually think about why those changes are being made, or if you look at the tax law and something's like, that doesn't make sense to you, you might say, well, that's been there for a long period of time. You might realize that that this law hasn't changed for a long period of time, and they just haven't changed it, right? There's some things in the tax law where, you're like, why is there this thing for like $100 or something? It seems completely irrelevant. The amount that is being deducted here doesn't seem to be relevant at this point in time. Maybe it's been on the books for a long period of time and they haven't removed it. So if you understand those types of things, it could be a little bit more interesting to look at the tax law.